Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
My husband came home with lipstick on his shirt collar. "It was an accident," he said. I recognized my sister's lipstick. For 3 days, I said nothing. On the fourth day, I invited my sister for dinner. When she walked in, her husband and good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Life, before it all fell apart, looked exactly the way I had always wanted it to look. Daniel and I had been married for 9 years. We lived in a pale yellow house on Clover Street in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where people wave from driveways and someone always brings a casserole when there's been a death. We had a mortgage, 2 cars, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a shared calendar on our phones. We had dinners on Fridays and church on most Sundays. We had, I believed, a life. I was a high school English teacher. Daniel worked in commercial real estate. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, stable. And stability, I had learned from my mother, was its own kind of love. My sister Melissa lived 20 minutes away, in a newer development near the highway. She had married Greg Holloway 6 years ago, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who worked in IT and rarely raised his voice about anything. Melissa was 32 to my 35. She was louder than me, more social, better at parties. Growing up, people always remembered her name first. I had made peace with that years ago, or so I thought. We saw each other twice a month, sometimes more. Sunday brunches, birthday dinners, the occasional shopping trip. Our mother, who had passed 4 years earlier, would have been pleased. "The girls are close," she used to say. "That's the most important thing." I believed her. The first sign came in September. Small. Almost nothing. Daniel had started going to the gym in the evenings. 3, sometimes 4 times a week. He had never been particularly interested in fitness before. The man had eaten frozen burritos for lunch every day for 6 years. But I told myself it was a midlife adjustment. He was 41. Men did this. I had read articles about it. But the gym closed at 10. And twice that month, he came home at 11:15. I asked once, lightly. "Traffic," he said. I stopped for gas. He kissed me on the forehead and went to shower. I didn't push. That was my first mistake. In October, Melissa started canceling plans. A brunch here, a phone call cut short there. She was busy, she said. Work had gotten complicated. She and Greg were going through a thing. She never elaborated. I gave her space because that's what you do for sisters. You don't crowd them when they're struggling. Greg called me once during that time, on a Tuesday afternoon. He sounded tired. He asked if I'd seen Melissa recently, and when I said no, not in a few weeks, there was a silence that lasted just a beat too long. "She's fine," I said, filling the gap. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." We hung up, and I stood in my kitchen for a moment, staring at the refrigerator covered in magnets from places Daniel and I had traveled. I felt something then. Not a thought, exactly. More like a vibration. A low, humming unease I couldn't name. I named it anxiety. I took a walk with Biscuit. I made dinner. November came, and with it, a Tuesday I will never forget as long as I live. Daniel came home at 6:30, which was normal. He dropped his keys on the counter, which was normal. He loosened his tie and walked toward me to say hello, which was normal. I leaned in to kiss him, and that's when I saw it. The collar of his white dress shirt, a print, a smear, really. The deep, unmistakable burgundy of lipstick. I stepped back. My eyes locked onto it the way your eyes lock onto something wrong in a room. The way you notice a crooked picture frame before you can even explain why you looked up. "What's that?" I asked. He looked down. A half-second pause. The smallest recalibration behind his eyes. "Oh, that's nothing. Someone at the office. A colleague." She hugged me goodbye. "Weird. Accident." He smiled, shrugged, walked past me toward the bedroom. I stood in the kitchen with the refrigerator magnets and the smell of something I'd left too long on the stove, and I felt the vibration again. Louder this time, because I recognized that shade of burgundy. It was the same color Melissa had been wearing the last time I saw her. A new lipstick she'd bought, she'd told me, holding it up to show me. "Isn't it perfect? It's called Midnight Fig." I didn't say anything that evening, or the next day, or the day after that. I said nothing for 3 days. But inside, something very quiet and very cold had begun to wake up. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I went to work. I taught The Great Gatsby to juniors who had no patience for Fitzgerald and even less for symbolism. I graded papers at my desk during lunch. I drove home. I made dinner. I asked Daniel about his day, and he told me about a commercial property deal near Dublin, and I nodded and said that sounds promising, and I passed him the salad, and I did not look at his collar. I was performing a life, and I was doing it well enough that no one noticed. But at night, when Daniel slept, I lay in the dark and I counted. I counted the canceled brunches, the shortened phone calls, the way Melissa had laughed too loudly at Daniel's jokes at my birthday dinner in August, something she never used to do because she had always, quietly, found him a little dull. I counted the evenings Daniel came home late, smelling of fresh soap, which I had told myself was the gym, and I counted the way Greg had sounded on the phone. Probably. One word. That single word had carried the weight of something he didn't want to say out loud. How long? That was the question I couldn't stop asking the ceiling. How long had this been happening under my roof, at my table, inside the life I had built with my own 2 hands? Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as a kind of cold clarity, like the moment before a car accident when everything slows and you see every detail with horrible precision. That's what I felt on the 3rd night. Not hysteria, not tears, just clarity. I could confront Daniel. I could scream and cry and throw the Midnight Fig incident in his face and watch him lie to me with more sophistication. I knew him. 9 years had given me that. I knew exactly how he would maneuver. He would be wounded. He would be reasonable. He would say I was reading into things. He would make me feel unstable for suspecting him. He had done it before with smaller things, and I had always backed down because I hated conflict, and because I loved him, and because I wanted the pale yellow house and the shared calendar to mean what I needed them to mean. If I confronted him now, with nothing but a smear of lipstick and a pattern of late evenings, I would lose. Not the argument, the war. He would regroup. He would cover his tracks. And Melissa would do exactly what she'd always done when we disagreed. Turn on the warmth, hug me too tightly, and make me feel like the difficult one. No, I was not going to do that. I got out of bed at 2 a.m, and I went to the kitchen, and I sat at the table with a glass of water, and I thought for a very long time. What did I actually know? I knew about the lipstick. I knew about the pattern of absences. I knew about Greg's voice on the phone. I knew about the way Melissa had looked at Daniel in August. None of this was proof. It was inference. It was instinct. And instinct, in a courtroom or a kitchen, wasn't enough. What did I need? I needed evidence. Real, undeniable, documented evidence. Not for drama, for protection. If this marriage was ending, I was not going to be the woman who walked out of it with nothing because she'd been too proud to prepare. I had given 9 years. I had given up a graduate program I'd been accepted to so we could move to Columbus for Daniel's career. I had given, and I was not going to leave empty-handed because I was too emotional to think straight. I opened my laptop at 2:30 in the morning and I started researching. I read about Ohio divorce law for 2 hours. I learned that Ohio is a no-fault state, meaning fault doesn't automatically affect the settlement, but that evidence of infidelity can influence alimony determinations and, in some cases, asset division if marital funds were used. I wrote that down. I wrote down the name of a family law attorney, a woman named Carol Simmons, whose reviews online described her as methodical and relentless. 2 words I needed to become myself. I also ordered a small digital voice recorder from Amazon. Prime delivery, 2 days. It arrived on a Thursday. I put it in my purse and said nothing to anyone. That Saturday, I called Melissa. "Hey," I said. My voice was warm, normal, the voice of a sister who suspected nothing. "I feel like we've been ships in the night lately. Let me cook. Come for dinner next week. Bring Greg." A brief pause. Then, "Oh, Rach. Yeah, of course. That would be so nice." She sounded almost relieved. She had no idea that the dinner invitation was not an olive branch. It was the opening move. Monday morning, I called Carol Simmons' office before I left for school. Her assistant, a calm woman named Diane, scheduled me for a consultation that Wednesday at 4:30. I wrote it in my personal planner, not the shared calendar. A small act, but deliberate. I was already learning to operate in a separate space, a space Daniel didn't have visibility into. I taught Gatsby again on Monday. We talked about the green light, about wanting something so badly you reconstruct your entire life around the wanting, about how that kind of obsession blinds you to what's real. 17-year-olds stared at me with varying levels of engagement. I stood at the whiteboard and I thought, I understand Gatsby now in a way I never did before. Not the romance of it, the destruction of it. Wednesday afternoon, I drove to Carol Simmons' office, a clean suite on the 4th floor of a building downtown. She was in her early 50s, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of steady gaze that made you feel like she had heard everything and been surprised by nothing. I told her what I knew, the lipstick, the late evenings, the pattern, the shared lipstick shade. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked 3 questions. Did we have joint assets? Yes. The house, 2 accounts, a retirement fund. Did I have independent income? Yes. Teaching salary. Did I have any documentation yet? Not yet, I said. She nodded. Then document. She slid a card across the desk. Don't confront, don't signal, collect. She recommended a licensed private investigator named Mark Okafor. She said he was discreet and thorough. She said I should call him before the end of the week. I called him from the school parking lot on Thursday. He quoted me a flat fee for 2 weeks of periodic surveillance. I paid him a deposit from my personal savings account, money I had been setting aside for years, quietly, the way some women collect recipes or shoes. I had always told myself it was for a rainy day. It was raining now. That same week, I noticed the first shift in Daniel. He came home Thursday to find me reading at the kitchen table, something I did often, but he paused at the doorway a half-second longer than usual. "Good day?" he asked. "Fine," I said, without looking up. "Yours?" He said it was fine. He went to pour himself a drink, and I heard the cabinet open and close, open and close. The small, restless movements of a man who was recalibrating. He was watching me, not with guilt, with assessment. I kept my face entirely neutral. I turned a page I hadn't actually read. The dinner was set for Saturday. I had told Melissa 7 o'clock, come casual. I spent Friday preparing, not just the food, but the room. I placed the voice recorder in the small decorative bowl on the sideboard, buried under a cluster of keys and loose change. I tested the range. It picked up conversation clearly from 6 feet away. I made roast chicken, roasted vegetables, a good bottle of wine. Melissa arrived first, at 5 to 7. Greg was quiet, as always, but he hugged me with both arms and held on a moment longer than usual. His eyes, when he pulled back, were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Daniel opened the wine. We sat. We talked about ordinary things, Greg's job, a trip Melissa said they were thinking about taking, the neighborhood's new coffee shop, ordinary sounds in ordinary rooms. And then, 40 minutes in, Daniel went to the kitchen to refill the wine, and Melissa's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, turned the screen face down, and looked up. Directly at me, she smiled, a half-second too late. I reached for the breadbasket. I smiled back. Later, after they left, I retrieved the recorder. I sat in the bathroom with the door locked, and I played it back through my earbuds. Dinner conversation, dishes clinking, the dog moving across the floor. And then, a moment when Greg had stepped outside to take a call, a voice, low and close, near the sideboard, Daniel's voice saying to Melissa, "She doesn't know anything. Stop worrying." And Melissa's voice, almost a whisper, "She seemed different tonight." A pause, then Daniel again. "She's fine. You're overthinking it." I sat on the edge of the bathtub. My hands were steady. My breathing was slow. I had them. I sent the recording to Carol Simmons by encrypted email on Sunday morning. She called me back within the hour. Her voice was the same measured tone, but there was something underneath it now, a focused energy. "This is useful," she said. "It establishes knowledge and concealment on both parties. Combined with what Okafor brings in, we'll have a strong foundation." She told me to sit tight for the week. Let Mark work. Don't change anything at home. I didn't change anything. I made Daniel his coffee. I asked about the Dublin property deal. I listened to him talk. I looked at his face, a face I had once memorized with love, and I saw it differently now. Not with hatred exactly, with a kind of sad, clear-eyed recognition. He was a man who had made a choice, decided it was manageable, and then made it again. On Thursday, Mark Okafor sent me a secure folder, 6 photographs. 2 of them showed Daniel's car parked outside a hotel in Westerville on a Tuesday evening. The same evening, he had told me he was visiting a property site. One showed Daniel and Melissa entering the hotel lobby together, her hand on the inside of his arm. The way you touch someone you've touched before. I printed nothing. I saved everything to a USB drive I kept in my classroom desk at school. The plan, as Carol and I had outlined it, was to file for divorce the following Monday. Serve Daniel at his office. Clean, documented, no warning. By the time I filed, I would have documentation of the affair, the recording, and a clear accounting of all joint assets. Carol had already prepared the financial disclosure forms. I had 4 days, but I made a mistake on Saturday. I left my laptop open in the kitchen while I took Biscuit for a walk. 15 minutes. When I came back, Daniel was standing near the counter, and the laptop, which I had been using to draft a timeline for Carol, had been moved 2 inches, maybe 3. The kind of distance that means someone picked it up and set it down. I don't know what he read or how much. But that evening, he was very quiet in the specific way of someone who is thinking, not simply resting. Sunday he left without telling me where he was going. He came back 4 hours later. Melissa was with him. They sat at my kitchen table, my table, in my house, and Daniel spoke first. His voice was calm, controlled. He said he knew I had been looking into things. He said he didn't know what I thought I had found, but that whatever it was, I was misunderstanding. He said he wanted to talk before things went somewhere they couldn't come back from. Melissa said almost nothing. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes wet, and she looked like a woman rehearsing grief. I sat across from them and I said, "I'm listening." Daniel then said, and I will never forget this, that if I pursued this path, he would make things complicated. He knew people. He said the word complicated with the careful precision of someone using a word in place of a threat. He mentioned that he had receipts for the house down payment, implying his contribution was larger than I remembered. He said a divorce would be messy and expensive and long. It was a threat, dressed in the language of concern. Melissa finally spoke. She said she was sorry for any confusion. She said she loved me. She reached across the table for my hand. I let her take it. "I hear you both," I said. "I need some time to think." They left believing they had won something. They had given me exactly what I needed, a documented pattern of coordinated intimidation that Carol would later describe in her notes as witness tampering behavior. I filed for divorce Monday morning at 9 a.m. Daniel was served at his office at 11:45. I know because Carol's paralegal sent me a confirmation text while I was eating a sandwich at my desk during lunch, looking out the window at a gray Ohio sky, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, that I could breathe. I took 3 days after the filing. I called in a personal day from school on Tuesday. I drove to a small state park outside the city and walked for 2 hours with Biscuit. I sat by a creek and I ate an apple, and I let myself cry for the first time. Not ugly crying. The quiet kind. The kind that comes after the decision has already been made and the grief is clean. I cried for the marriage I thought I had, for the sister I thought I knew. Then I dried my face, drove home, fed the dog. I was ready for whatever came next. The week after the filing, Daniel didn't scream. He didn't slam doors. He cooked breakfast. I came downstairs Tuesday morning. My personal day was over. I was back to routine. And he was standing at the stove making scrambled eggs. The good kind, low and slow, the way I had once taught him. There was coffee already brewed. He had put out 2 mugs. He turned when he heard me on the stairs, and he gave me a look I recognized from early in our marriage. Open, a little sheepish. The face of a man who believed he could still reach me. "I thought we could eat together," he said. Like normal. I poured my coffee. I sat down. I ate the eggs because I was hungry, and because sitting there calmly was less informative to him than leaving the room. He talked. He said he had been thinking. He said marriages went through phases. He said what had happened, he still wouldn't name it directly, was a lapse in judgment that had no bearing on how much he loved me. He said the word love 3 times in 4 minutes, and each time it landed with less weight than the last. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. I looked at his hand, then at his face. "Daniel," I said, "I have an 8 o'clock class." I picked up my bag and I left. Melissa's approach was different. She showed up at my school on Wednesday afternoon, waited in the parking lot, which was a choice that told me she knew I wouldn't have agreed to a meeting. She was in her car when I walked out at 3:15, and she got out when she saw me, and she was already crying before she said a word. "Please," she said, "Rachel, just talk to me." I stopped. I looked at her. The thing about Melissa was that she had always been better at emotion than me, more fluid with it, more willing to use it. Growing up, I had admired that. Standing in a school parking lot in November, I saw it for what it was, a tool. "This is going to destroy our family," she said. "Mom would be devastated." The mention of our mother was the hardest blow she could have landed, and she knew it. She had always known where to press. I felt the ache of it, real, physical, in the center of my chest. But I had spent enough nights in the dark counting things to know that an ache was not a reason to stop. "Melissa," I said, "you should talk to your own lawyer." I walked to my car. She called twice that evening. I didn't answer. Daniel was quiet the rest of the week. Careful. He moved through the house like a man in a room with an uncertain floor, testing each step before he committed to it. He was watching me for cracks, looking for the moment I would wobble and become someone he could redirect. There was no wobble, but I knew I couldn't sustain this entirely alone. Strength without support is just stubbornness, and stubbornness alone wears down. I needed people. I called my friend Diane, not Carol's assistant, a different Diane, my oldest friend from college, who lived now in Cincinnati. I told her everything. She drove up that Friday and stayed through the weekend, and we sat in the living room with wine, and she listened and did not once tell me to consider his side. She was furious on my behalf in the precise way I needed her to be. She also helped me find a therapist, a woman named Dr. Andrea Holt, who had a practice in Worthington. I had my first session the following Tuesday. I had never been to therapy before. I had always believed I could manage my interior life through sheer organizational competence. Dr. Holt very gently suggested that was not the same thing as actually processing it. I found her both irritating and correct. 2 colleagues at school, Susan and Terrence, both of whom had navigated their own divorces, quietly circled around me. They didn't ask questions. They saved me a seat at the lunch table. They brought coffee without being asked. I was not alone, and Daniel, watching me become less isolated rather than more, grew visibly less certain. He had counted on the opposite. They came on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the filing, and they did it together, which told me everything. Melissa rang the doorbell at 10. She was holding a dish, something covered in foil. A casserole, I realized when she held it out. Our mother's chicken casserole recipe, the one she made when someone was sick or grieving. The detail was so precisely calculated that I almost had to admire it. She had gone home, found our mother's handwritten recipe card, and made it from scratch. That took time. That took effort. That told me how seriously they were taking this visit, which told me, in turn, how seriously they feared what I was doing. Daniel was behind her on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression arranged into something soft and earnest that I recognized as his client meeting face. The one that had closed deals in commercial real estate for 15 years. I opened the door. I stepped back. I let them in because I was curious. And because Dr. Holt had said, in our second session, that a key quality of people in genuine crisis was the ability to observe clearly instead of simply reacting. I was practicing observation. We sat in the living room. Melissa put the casserole on the coffee table as if she intended it to do emotional work. Maybe she did. Daniel sat forward with his elbows on his knees, a posture of sincerity. He had clearly thought about his posture. He had clearly thought about all of it. Daniel spoke first. He said he knew the filing had happened and he wasn't there to fight it. He said he only wanted one conversation, a real one, before things went to a place they couldn't come back from. He said we had 9 years. He said the word years the way people say it when they mean to make you feel the weight of something you're about to discard. I nodded. I said nothing. Melissa picked up the thread. She talked about family. She talked about what divorce does to extended relationships, cousins, holidays, mutual friends. She talked about Greg, which surprised me, though it shouldn't have. She said Greg was struggling, and that all of this was bigger than the two of us, and that people we both loved were being caught in something they didn't deserve. She paused there, letting the sentence breathe, watching my face for any sign of softening. The irony of Melissa expressing concern for Greg's well-being in that context was so profound that I had to look briefly at the window to compose myself. "What is it you actually want?" I asked. Daniel leaned further forward. He wanted me to withdraw the filing. He would agree to couples counseling. He would, he said, do the work. He would be transparent, accountable, present. All the correct verbs assembled in the correct order by someone who had rehearsed them. And if not, Melissa's voice came in here, softer. Then they both hoped I would think carefully about the financial implications. Daniel had already spoken to a lawyer, she said. He believed the house valuation could be contested, the down payment, the timeline of contributions. He had documentation, she implied, that painted a different picture of who had built this life. There it was. Under the casserole and the soft voices and the 9 years, the threat had been there the whole time. It had simply needed the softer approaches to fail before it showed itself. I looked at my sister. I thought about Midnight Fig. I thought about the hotel parking lot photographs in a USB drive in my classroom desk. I thought about Daniel's voice saying she doesn't know anything into a recorder sitting in a bowl of loose change on my own sideboard. "Melissa," I said, "do you have a lawyer yet?" She blinked. Rachel, that's not what this is. "You should get one," I said. "A good one." I stood. "I think that's everything for today." Daniel stood too, and the client face was gone. "Don't do this," he said. "Not soft now. Flat and stripped of performance. You will regret making this difficult." "You should go," I said. He held my gaze for a long moment. There was something new in it. Not the calculation he'd worn through most of this visit, but something rawer. The look of a man who had just understood that the person across from him was not going to flinch. I held his gaze steadily. Neither of us was who the other had expected us to be in the end. They left. Melissa took the casserole. She picked it up from the coffee table without looking at me, and the small, careful way she carried it out, like someone holding onto the last prop of a play that had already ended, stayed with me after the door closed. I stood with my back against the door, and I let the fear come, because it had earned its moment. My hands were trembling slightly. Daniel's final tone had carried the specific weight of a man who still believed he had resources I didn't know about. He probably did. Carol had warned me that a contested divorce could drag counterclaims, deposition delays, valuation disputes. This was not going to be clean. But fear, I had learned over the last 2 months, was not the opposite of courage. It was the presence of something worth protecting. Every time I felt it now, I asked myself the same question. What are you afraid of losing? The pale yellow house? The shared calendar? A marriage that had been a managed performance for at least a year, possibly 2. No, I was afraid of losing myself. The self that had sat at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning and decided, quietly and without drama, that she deserved better than this. That was not a reason to stop. It was the only reason to continue. I called Carol on Monday morning and told her everything. The casserole, the posture, the veiled threat about the down payment, Daniel's final words at the door. She listened without interrupting. "Good," she said. "Let them push. We're ready for all of it." The formal mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday in January, 9 weeks after I had filed. Ohio law encourages mediation before contested divorce proceedings, and Carol had used that window strategically. She wanted them in a room. She wanted their lawyer to see what we had before they decided how hard to fight. Their attorney was a man named Warren Briggs. Daniel had retained him, which meant the representation was technically Daniel's, though Carol had observed in our prep session that Daniel's interests and Melissa's were not necessarily aligned once pressure was applied. "When the story has 2 authors," Carol said, setting her pen down, "it tends to develop contradictions." She said it the way someone states a fact they have observed enough times to stop finding interesting. We arrived first. Carol and I sat on one side of a long conference table in a building downtown, 14 floors up, with a gray January sky through the window behind us. I wore gray. I had slept well the night before, which surprised me and, on reflection, probably shouldn't have. There is a specific calm that comes with having done everything you could do. Not the calm of certainty, but the calm of preparation. There was nothing left to second guess. Daniel and Melissa entered together. Briggs followed them, already opening his briefcase. They sat across from us. Daniel's jaw was set. Melissa didn't look at me for the first 2 minutes of preamble. When she finally did, her expression was composed and careful. The expression of someone who had also prepared, but differently. She had prepared emotionally. I had prepared evidentially. Those are different kinds of armor, and only one of them holds up under documentation. The session opened with Briggs presenting their position, that the marriage had broken down due to mutual neglect and incompatibility, that Daniel's financial contribution to the marital home was disproportionate and warranted adjusted asset division, and that the evidence I claimed to have was largely circumstantial and context-dependent. Carol let him finish completely. She thanked him for the overview. Then she opened her folder without any change in expression. She presented the photographs first. Mark Okafor's work was precise and thorough, each image stamped with date, time, and location, cross-referenced against the property visit Daniel had logged in his own work calendar for the same evenings. His car in the hotel parking lot. Daniel and Melissa in the lobby, her hand inside his arm. A second image taken 40 minutes later, showing the same car still in the lot. The timestamps were not ambiguous. Briggs studied the photographs with a professional lack of expression. Daniel looked at the table. His hands on the table were very still, which told me more than movement would have. Melissa, I noticed, looked at Daniel. Not at Carol, not at the photographs, not at me, at Daniel, looking for something, reassurance or instruction, or simply the confirmation that he was still holding the story together. He was not looking back. Then Carol played the recording. Just the relevant 14 seconds. The room heard Daniel's voice. She doesn't know anything. Stop worrying. Melissa's voice. She seemed different tonight. Then Daniel. She's fine. You're overthinking it. The room was very quiet. Even the building seemed to hold its breath. That recording was made in your shared marital home? Carol asked me. For the record. Yes, I said. In the common area, during a dinner I hosted for my sister and her husband. Briggs asked for a recess immediately. The three of them stepped out. Carol poured water. I looked at the gray sky. We waited 11 minutes. When they came back, the geometry of their group had changed. Daniel and Melissa were no longer moving with the same physical cohesion. There was distance between them now, subtle but unmistakable, the way people unconsciously separate when they stop being a team and start being individuals with competing problems. Briggs worked to reframe the recording. He suggested the conversation had been taken out of context, that the phrasing was ambiguous, that she doesn't know anything could refer to numerous topics. Carol asked, with genuine seeming curiosity, what other topic? In the home of the woman Daniel was married to, in the presence of the woman he had been photographed entering a hotel with, the phrase might have referred to. Briggs said he would need time to review the full context. Carol said she looked forward to his written response. Then Melissa spoke, and she should not have. I think she knew it the moment she started. People often do. But the pressure of holding a story in a room full of evidence is its own particular weight, and sometimes it becomes too much. She said that she and Daniel had not been conducting a sustained affair. She said the hotel visit had been, and here she stopped, rearranged, started again. A mistake. A single mistake. She said she didn't want to lose her marriage over something that had been, she insisted, a temporary lapse. She said Greg didn't know. And with those 3 words, she handed us everything. Because she had not said, this didn't happen. She had not said, the evidence is wrong. She had said, my husband doesn't know. Which confirmed the nature of what had happened in her own words, and revealed that her presence in this room was not about reconciling with me. It was about protecting herself from the consequence waiting for her at home. Daniel looked at her. 3 seconds. No more. But it was the look of a man watching a shared structure collapse, and knowing that the person across from him had just pulled out the foundational piece. I think we should conclude for today, Briggs said. Carol agreed pleasantly and began gathering her folder. As we stood to leave, I looked at Daniel for the first and only time since we'd sat down. He looked tired in a way I recognized. Not the tiredness of guilt, exactly, but the tiredness of sustained maintenance. He had been holding something heavy for a very long time. He had put it down now, one way or another. I picked up my bag. I walked out into the January cold, and I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, not the hot satisfaction of winning. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. The feeling of a sentence that has been waiting for months to find its period. And finally has. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in late March. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no final argument, no last-minute appeal, no moment where Daniel stood up and said something that changed anything. Just Carol calling me at 4:15 to say that Daniel's attorney had accepted the settlement terms without further contest and that the judge had signed the decree. I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot at the time, still in my coat, watching the last students push through the main doors in the pale afternoon light. It's done, Carol said. Thank you, I said. We stayed on the line for a moment, the kind of pause that doesn't need filling. And then she said, with the particular warmth that methodical people allow themselves in rare circumstances. You were very well prepared, Rachel. That's what made all of this possible. The documentation, the patience, the consistency, all of it. A beat. Not everyone can do that, especially not under those circumstances. I thanked her again. We hung up. I sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes before I drove home. The settlement had not been what Daniel anticipated. The house was to be sold, with the equity divided 60-40 in my favor, a ratio reflecting my documented financial contributions over 9 years, and the court's recognition of what Carol had consistently and precisely referred to in her filings as deliberate misrepresentation of marital circumstances. Every late evening accounted for, every alibi cross-referenced. The photographs, the recording, the timeline, all of it had constructed a record that Briggs, in the end, had not been able to dismantle because it was simply true. Daniel's argument about the down payment had some factual basis. His initial contribution had been slightly larger than mine. But Carol had presented the full picture. 9 years of my salary direct deposited into joint accounts, 9 years of household management, 9 years of career decisions made around his geographic and professional needs. The mortgage broker's records supported our counter-argument cleanly. The judge had been unimpressed by Briggs' framing. The retirement accounts were split according to the standard formula, with an adjustment in my favor given the graduate program I had deferred, documentation of which Carol had requested and I had provided from my archived emails. It had taken me an evening to find. It had been worth every minute. I also received biscuit, which was not disputed. Daniel had never particularly attached to the dog. That, too, told you something. Daniel moved out in February, first to a hotel, and then to a short-term rental in Westerville, the same suburb where a hotel parking lot had appeared in a set of time-stamped photographs. Whether that choice was made from convenience or defiance, or some unexamined instinct pulling him toward the geography of the secret he'd kept, I didn't try to analyze. I had stopped trying to understand his internal logic. It was no longer relevant to my life. What was relevant was that Greg had found out. He found out the week after mediation. I had not contacted him directly. Carol had strongly advised against it, and I had followed that advice. But information in a legal process has its own momentum. It moves through attorney communications, through the process of disclosure, through the simple fact that when multiple people are involved in the same documented events, the documentation eventually reaches everyone it concerns. Greg called me on a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks after mediation. His voice was quiet. The same quality of quiet I had heard in that very first phone call, months ago, when he'd asked if I'd seen Melissa recently, and I'd said no, and there had been a silence that lasted just a beat too long. This time, the tiredness in his voice was different. It was the particular exhaustion of a man who had suspected something for long enough that the confirmation was almost a relief, and then hated himself for feeling relieved. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said. "Don't apologize to me, Greg," I said. I meant it completely. He had nothing to apologize for. He had been as deceived as I had, by the same people, over the same period of time, inside the same extended family that was now quietly coming apart at every seam. He filed for divorce from Melissa 4 days later. Melissa called me twice after she found out. Once the evening Greg told her he knew, once 3 days later. I didn't answer either call. I sat with my phone in my hand both times, and I thought about what I might say, And each time I arrived at the same conclusion, there was nothing left to say that the mediation room hadn't already said, with greater precision and fewer words than I could manage. The house on Clover Street sold in April to a young couple in their late 20s. A neighbor I ran into at the grocery store told me they had already repainted the front door. Dark red, apparently. Good. The house had been pale yellow for long enough. It deserved a new color, chosen by people who were beginning something rather than ending it. I stood in the empty living room on the final walkthrough, just me and Biscuit, looking at the walls, the nail holes where the picture frames had been, the kitchen where I had stood looking at refrigerator magnets and told myself I was anxious when I was, in fact, already standing in the wreckage of a different life than the one I'd believed I was living. I felt sad. I want to say that clearly, because the alternative would be dishonest. 9 years is not nothing. Even a life built on a compromise has weight. Even a marriage that turned out to be something other than what I thought it was had been, in its early years, genuinely mine. I had loved Daniel. I had loved Melissa my entire life. Grief doesn't require that the love was deserved. It just requires that it was real. But I also stood in that empty room and felt, underneath the sadness, something steady and unambiguous, that what came next would be mine. Chosen deliberately, built carefully, answerable to no one's evasions but my own. I locked the door for the last time. I put the key in the lockbox. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. Not because I was being dramatic about it, simply because there was nothing back there I needed to see again. A year later, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the short north neighborhood of Columbus, on the 3rd floor of a building with tall windows and a coffee shop directly below that opened at 6:30. I had the bedroom I slept in, the bedroom I used as a study, and a small balcony where Biscuit was technically not supposed to be, but where he sat every morning anyway, looking at the street with dignified satisfaction. I was 36 years old. I was starting over. It did not feel like starting over. It felt like arriving. My teaching had deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. I applied for, and received, a position as department chair, which came with a salary increase and responsibilities I genuinely enjoyed. I started teaching an elective on creative nonfiction. My students, who were 17 and occasionally insufferable and occasionally extraordinary, continued to teach me things about language and attention that I could not have learned elsewhere. I had also, quietly, started writing. Nothing public, nothing with a destination, just a document on my laptop that I added to in the evenings. An attempt to put the year into words, to understand it, to contain it. Dr. Holt had suggested it. She had been right about most things. Diane drove up from Cincinnati every couple of months, and we went to dinner and talked for hours the way we had in college, with the ease of people who know each other's whole story. Susan and Terrence at school became genuine friends. I had a life with edges and textures, and people in it who knew me and chose to stay. In November, 14 months after the filing, I had dinner with a man named James, who taught philosophy at the local university and had been introduced to me by Terrence. He was thoughtful and genuinely funny and asked questions he actually wanted to hear the answers to. We had dinner 3 times that month. He held Biscuit's leash during a walk in the park and laughed when the dog stopped to investigate every single fallen leaf. I wasn't ready to call it anything yet, but I was ready for the first time in a long time to find out. The pale yellow house on Clover Street had sold quickly to a young couple who had already repainted the front door red. Good. The house deserved new decisions. Daniel had moved into an apartment in Westerville. the same suburb where Mark Okafor had photographed his car outside a hotel. Whether the irony was visible to him, I couldn't say. His arrangement with Melissa had not survived the exposure. Whatever they had believed they were to each other had been built inside secrecy, and secrecy, when removed, often reveals that there was very little underneath. They lasted perhaps 6 weeks as a declared couple before it quietly dissolved. I learned this from Greg, with whom I had maintained a careful and decent friendship. Two people handed the same information who had made similar decisions. Daniel was renting month to month. The Dublin deal had fallen through. He had changed firms. I did not follow his story closely. It was not my story anymore. Melissa's divorce from Greg was finalized 2 months after mine. She had lost her footing in our shared social world. Mutual friends who drifted, as people do when a center no longer holds. She had made her choices, and those choices had consequences. I did not gloat. Gloating requires ongoing investment in someone else's story, and I had withdrawn mine. I sent her a card at Christmas, not to reconcile, just to confirm for myself that I wasn't carrying bitterness the way some people carry injury, limping with it, defining themselves by it. I mailed the card and went to Diane's for Christmas and laughed for most of the evening and came home to Biscuit waiting at the door with the expectant dignity of a dog who knows exactly what he deserves. I sat on my couch with the tall windows and the coffee shop below, and I thought, this is mine, entirely irreducibly mine. I'm not going to tell you the lesson was simple. It never is. What I know now is this. The moment I stopped waiting for someone else to tell me the truth and decided to find it myself, that was the moment I stopped losing. Betrayal doesn't break you. Staying silent when you know better, that does. If this had happened to you, if you sat at that table and recognized the lipstick on the collar, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.